Thank you. It's always an honor to be in this room. I haven't been on the stage nearly as many times as I've been in the audience.
But scary.
I guess it's a little bit scary. I was scared in anticipation of this particular event because of a kind of reverence that I feel for the project that you created. You know, there are a lot of good and important books written every year. And there are good and important television programs made with some regularity, if not exactly every year. But this is a very, very special project, and one that I think will really change the world, and also has the potential to stick around, to be something that people continue to read and view and talk about and reference for quite a long time. So I just couldn't be more honored to share a stage with you tonight.
Thank you.
Now, in a recent interview on the occasion of the publication of this book, you remarked, "I knew I had to have a go at this before I died." So this struck me as not only an interesting thing for a Jewish person to say about a history of the Jews, but a very Jewish thing to say. After reading it, I called my older brother, who is quite knowledgeable about things Jewish, and I said, "Jesus, is Schama dying?" And he said, "Are you not?" And what I wanted to ask you is, it's clear that you're Jewish, and it's clear that you're a historian of the Jews. Do you think of yourself as a Jewish historian? Does that distinction make any sense?
Not until, I should say, just apropos that lovely remark, is that, I guess at that point where the BBC phoned me up, as it were, and I did not mean to give the impression that I was ailing seriously, but Shalom Aleichen's dead, Saul Beller's dead, and occasionally I don't feel too well, really. So I thought, my father always used to say, you regret the things you don't do. But the question you've just asked, I don't think I do particularly, until this particular project. Because, as you know, the way the book in particular deals with the Bible are those passages in the Bible. So you didn't want to do, was Abraham there, and when was he there, and so on. What interested me, without it being really too smartly postmodern and self-conscious, were the passages of the Bible where the act of writing, or the book itself, is its own star of the chapter. I mean, rereading Ezekiel, for example, there's this extraordinary moment where some winged monster, who appears in one of Ezekiel's trippy visions, says, "And now digest, the word of God." And he said, "Well, I already have." And the creature says, "No, I mean eat it." Again, very Jewish. So he has to actually cram his mouth by consuming that part of the Bible before he's allowed actually to discourse on it. And what interests me is all the moments really where, oh, surprise, surprise, while renovating the down-at-heel temple, the servants of King Josiah, Hilkiah the scribe, discover the missing book, which has been lost. What's actually happened is a long period of idolatry has taken place. So the book, rather like the basalt column, in 2001, keeps kind of cropping up. And the sense in which the book is the fetish rather than, that became very interesting to me, hence Finding the Words and the title of Volume 2, When Words Fail. I don't want to say that that's, Jewishly postmodern, but certainly then that took me back to, a long time ago when I was in Cheder and taught in Hebrew school and did a little bit of Gemara. Actually, I had Mr. Melnick, who, when one wasn't paying attention, it's incredibly easy, I have to say this slightly irreverently, not to pay attention to every sentence of Gemara. He was at the same time very, to borrow your word, reverent about the Gemara, but he also slap you around the head with it, actually, as well. The same. Thank you, Mr. Melnick. And so I don't think so, but I will say, again, what did strike me, which is, again, in a Jewish way, a digression rather than, a clear answer. What certainly is the case that I was born in 45. I grew up in, the kind of burnt out. I didn't grow up in the ruins of London, but we were a seaside town. My dad used to take me into London, so I remember the kind of scorched dereliction of parts of the city of London and the East End, where my dad worked in schmutters. And I had the sense really early on that two kinds of history had been very badly damaged, Jewish history and English history, but were not out for the count. And because my father revered Churchill, in fact, I remember seeing on his bookshelf Trial and Error, Chaim Weizmann's book, next to, as if in companionship, the history of the English-speaking peoples. There was the sense that history in both those cases, in Jewish history and English history, was not simply a form of kind of romantic costume drama. It had something functionally to do with actually getting through disaster. And so I suppose really I'm constituted from those two traditions, which are both in their way wordy, contentious, noisy. I think English history was much noisier than one might suppose it to be from British universities. Beyond that, I mean, I suppose, again, just the last point I'd make, really, is that the great book about the relationship of history proper, as it were, history based on sources that are not entirely in the Bible or in the Talmud, but based on, harder kinds of documents, has a very complicated relationship with Jewish memory. I mean, that's Yosef Yerushalmi's book called Zachor. Have you read it? Mm-hmm. It's really a wonderful book. I loved, actually, by the way, this is a great book. Lots of you know it, I'm sure. That's its subject. It's about how kind of time stops, really, after the destruction of the temple, and then the canon is closed by the Tanaim and then the Amoraim, and it takes a long time till the Renaissance for something recognizable as Jewish history to happen. But Yosef, wrote a book about memory. I wrote a book with the word memory in it, and he says that this is very Jewish. At one wonderful moment in that book, I was, of course, invited to a conference about memory, but I forgot where I put the invitation, so I didn't go.
Well, when you referred to these two kind of histories in rubble, English history and Jewish history, or histories in need of some kind of expansion or correction or revisitation, I was thinking about the uses of history. I had a sculpture teacher in college who said that art is the thing that has no use in the world, and once it has a use, it's no longer a work of art. So a bridge can't be a work of art because it allows people to cross divides. Architecture can never be art. And I didn't agree with him then, and I don't agree with him now, but it's an interesting way to think about things. So you write a lot about art. You also have written fiction. Your historical works are as literary as any novel, but they are not created as works of art per se. And I imagine you would agree that they have uses. So I was wondering how, when we think about the uses of history, we might think about documenting or commemorating or revising previous histories. I was wondering if you thought, you must have been aware of the uses of this project as you were embarking upon it.
Yeah, I did. Again, unhelpfully, I'm sorry about this, Jonathan. I should just want to go. You're making so many wonderful points that I want to pick up the first one before I come to the second one. But actually, I think art is about. I agree with you. I wouldn't agree with that utilitarian, saying once use happens. But I would say that art is actually about loss. Actually, very often it is an attempt to kind of fix things that are transient in time. At least painting very often is that. It's a futile kind of will-o'-the-wisp exercise, an attempt to kind of embalm a moment which otherwise is completely temporarily elusive to us. And that certainly, I don't know if that's right or wrong, it's not the absolute definition, I'm sure, but it's certainly true, the very beginning of history in a Western tradition. Herodotus, in the opening sentence, really, says that he's writing as a historia, which I'm no Greek scholar, but those who are tell me the first meaning of that word is a kind of analytical inquiry. It has a kind of forensic almost. So how did this come about, the wars of the Greeks and Persians? But it presupposes that an historia is also a story, is also kind of storytelling. And that weirdly, you can't actually get to the analytical question-probing aspect unless you embed it in narrative, because that's what we're all wired for. And if part of the mission is actually the transmission of a critical kind of memory. I mean, both Thucydides, who attacks Herodotus for a lot of things, is also committed to the notion that history is written, and this comes to your main point, not as a kind of act of self-congratulation or consolation, but actually as something which is gadfly-like, which is an inconvenience, which is why I think that the way Thucydides is actually used in core curriculum, including possibly my own at Columbia, always with the Pericles speech extracted as a sense of a community of what it is right to die for when you're in a democracy, is slightly misplaced, because that great work is narratively structured to end in catastrophe, the expedition to Syracuse. And therefore it is, in some sense, a kind of a critical exercise. Its honor, its virtue, its strength depends on that sort of fierce sense of criticism. So, yes, it's quite true. I think that, I was asked to complete a half-finished work by the great, formidable English historian of Jewry, Cecil Roth, 40 years ago. And I couldn't do it because I thought it was a kind of ridiculous act of temerity to try and do it, and also his style and my style didn't fit, and it wasn't going to work, and I wasn't remotely, I think, actually competent to do it then. But when the BBC phoned me up, the BBC, somebody said, Anshul Fefren Haaretz, that I've done a terrible thing to Israel by writing this book and making it serious, because it's deprived Israel of being able to accuse the BBC of being anti-Semitic. I was happy to do that. But when the BBC did say, this is an idea that occurs to us, and you'll either love it or you'll run away a million miles, I did feel I have to do it for exactly the reasons you imply in the question. And they're all rather slightly European, I think, issues which may not resonate with all of you out there. One is simply the immense gulf of ignorance about Jewish history out there in Britain and in Europe. And I think the sort of also intense sense that Jewish history is seen by the non-Jewish world as something which is only framed by the Shoah, by the Holocaust, or by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not that I skirt that in the series, or indeed in Volume 2, which I'm writing now, but that the sort of sense of one is an invitation to extreme polemics, one side or the other, or in the Shoah, for the non-Jewish world, if they're not Holocaust deniers, there is nothing to say except actually to have a deferential silence. And in other words, there was no kind of point of engagement or entry. And I felt that actually if I could, not change the subject exactly, but change the way people out there in a non-Jewish world could actually enter a subject which, after all, has incredibly important universal implications. Because if there's one subject which turns out to be the most intractable one in our lifetimes, other than the destruction we're wreaking on our own planet, it is something that would have dumbfounded the Enlightenment philosophers if they knew it was still going on. And that's the incredible difficulty of people of different beliefs have in sharing the same living space without the obligation to exterminate each other. And we Jews have lived that more acutely, more intensely, more relentlessly than possibly anyone else. Not to say that, Armenians and Gypsies and many other people haven't experienced much of the same. So I thought if there was a way really to tell that story of the, both those difficulties and the responses in terms of seizing life that go with it, that would be worth doing. So, yeah, I mean, I hate actually, I don't like normally framing the projects with this sense of slight kind of, Philistine civism, really, I suppose, I would say, any more that I always mind, I don't know if you do too, that literature is taught in high school as an exercise in civics. It's the sort of, you know, the sense it's the To Kill a Mockingbird syndrome. It's a wonderful book, but it's taught essentially for the moral good it would do you, rather than the way the words lie on the page. So I'm actually slightly averse to that. I actually want my slice of the past, the possibility of, as Auden said, making people feel they're breaking bread with the dead, to be delivered entirely in its own right. But in this particular case, these were considerations.
I think it's interesting the way that you were speaking about wanting to provide entry for a reader or for a viewer, wanting to invite people into a story that they are maybe naturally apprehensive about entering, or simply giving them a way to experience it rather than receive it as a lecture. And there were a couple of moments in both the book and the show that made me think about this kind of empathy, or an empathic opening. When you visited the synagogue in Venice, you said that you felt the pull of a rational memory, that you had been there before. And then at another moment, this is now in the book, when examining the earthenware of an architectural dig, you said, "I'm suddenly at home in this kitchen." And it reminded me of the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah, that asks for this most radical act of empathy, which is that we should not tell a story, but be actors in the story. Not reenactors, but actors. That we should feel as if we ourselves are being liberated from Egypt that evening.
Yeah, it does say that, doesn't it? Yeah.
I was curious about your own experiences of empathy as you were making this project, and also whether you gave any thought to the empathy of Jewish readers and viewers or non-Jewish readers and viewers.
Oh, you mean as different, whether I would swerve the text in some way to... I mean, the answer is no to the second one, no. I mean, I just wanted to kind of internalize it as a story. I suppose there are elements, I hope, in the book, maybe in the films as well, but actually certainly in the book, which are much less familiar to even Jewish readers. I don't know how many people know about the extraordinary colony of Judean mercenary soldiers in 5th century Egypt. I mean, I knew a bit about it, but not as much as I do now, and that was very important. So, but I did essentially sort of internalize the sense that I wanted somehow to make a kind of common, you know, a connection really between the really hungrily interested Jewish reader and the non-Jewish reader who had to be kind of persuaded into the story. But you know, obviously, I thought about that once and then just got on with it. I think the point about reenactment is very important, and I was always very struck by the historical philosopher of history called R.G. Collingwood, the Oxford philosopher, who wrote a book on the philosophy of history, and he described the obligation of the historian. He was an idealist philosopher, slightly metaphysical tendencies, and therefore rather alienated from the very fiercely Wittgenstein-like linguistic, analytical fashions in Oxford in the 1920s and 30s. And his notion was that really what historians had to do, he said exactly, used your word, to kind of reenact, actually, without any kind of license of fiction at all, but kind of imaginative reenact the story of which they were the scribe. And he used, I think, a rather nice metaphor. He thought of the book that was being written as a kind of dwelling place. It's almost a tabernacle-like dwelling place, and there was a kind of fine piece of cloth or fabric that was sort of thrown out, which was the imaginative reenactment, but it needed to be fixed by the poles of evidence, by the struts of evidence. And I think that's actually true of Jewish history. It's certainly true of what I did. I mean, in what I tried to do, I think actually that I was on my guard in the book, both I think, but particularly in the book, of collapsing time completely. I mean, whenever I felt, although I begin the book in that Egypt moment with a moment of what seemed to me extreme familiarity, which I'll come on to in a second. But whenever I thought I was really amidst the company in, I don't know, there with Josephus on the battlements or something. There was these children's books we grew up with in Britain, which literally had small children with Nelson at Trafalgar or Wellington and Waterloo, and they were preposterous. The one that was not preposterous, of course, which was profoundly, is Puck of Pook's Hill, Kipling's book, which I really loved. And that had, again, the illusion, dreamlike sense of actually being present at some... I'm sort of guarding against that sense of collapsing my time now into, but wow, sometimes it's, the familiarity is so real powerful. All history is a negotiation between strangeness and familiarity, I think, actually. In some ways, the past is a foreign country. It is unavailable to us. Our physical sensibilities are different. We have the benefit of aspirin and other things too. And on the other hand, there are extraordinary moments which are immediately recognizable as our natural human response. And those appear outside the Bible in so many places, actually. I mean, that it's very hard to resist that sense of being in the same dwelling space. I mean, I do begin the book rather shamelessly with one of them. It's one of these papyrus letters that, in this case, is written by a father. Can I tell this little story?
Please.
Okay, this father who is...
I'd prefer you didn't, but yes. Yeah, I would like to hear your story. You're nothing if not a great storyteller.
He says unconvincingly.
I would love it.
There's a father whose son is in this military colony in Upper Egypt. And the son he's been sent to this posting on the Nubian frontier. It turns out that not all Jews are writers or scholars or even doctors. You all know doctors. You know Dr. John and I were swapping jokes, so here's one. We'll have, we've got the African-American president, we'll probably get the woman president. So, of course, the next thing on is President Goldblatt. That's obvious. And so he says, Mum, you'll come to the inauguration. And she says, that's a long way. I've got nothing to wear. And he says, Mum, Air Force One, Neiman Marcus is yours. Not Neiman Marcus, we're fancy crowd. Saks Fifth Avenue is yours. And she says, all right. So she's there on the Capitol steps, and he's holding the Tanakh, of course, our bit of the Bible. And she does the elbow Jewish thing, and she says, see that man there? And the person who said, yeah, said, his brother is a doctor. So probably only that. So Jews are not always doctors. They sometimes are tough guys. If you wanted someone who would really be a ruthless enforcer on the Nubian-Egyptian frontier in the 5th century, you sent for the Jews. And the young man is sent to do duty in the south, and his father is supposed to, because we just have the letter from the father, we don't even know if the letter reached, a papyrus letter reached his son. He was supposed to get him back pay and new kit for the tropical dangerous posting. And the father's, it's an apology, it's an elaborate apology, and the father says, I'm really sorry, I missed you at Memphis, I tried to get the back pay, I was fobbed off, I couldn't quite get the kit. When you come back, I'll have everything ready for you. And then he realized he's sounding a bit shifty and pathetic, and he says, he does exactly he pulls the Jewish parent stunt. He said, of course, he says, my boy, when you went south, my heart is not great now, actually. I don't feel so great. And you go, okay, you can't. It's a fantastic moment of blackmail. And then I say, follow in Aramaic the 3 words from which all of Jewish history unfolds, against which there is no reply whatsoever. Likewise, your mother. Which is those moments collapse time, and they're there you can't run around them.
One of the things that I think distinguishes your work from other histories of the Jews, particularly the ones that I remember having grown up with, and I think was really well evidenced in that clip, is a kind of optimism, or at the very least, when there's a kind of when there's a fork in the road and one can look at something either with as tragic or as kind of like ironically about to be tragic, you instead say they were not, I can't remember the exact words here, but they weren't sitting on their hands waiting.
For their own destruction.
Yeah. And this is something that's been commented on, usually specifically in reference to how you treat the Holocaust. But I think it really runs throughout the entire book. Were you aware of that as you were doing it? Was it a choice that you made?
Yes, it is a choice I made. I mean, as in, you remember there's a little passage in the medieval film particularly where I open a exquisite, beautifully illuminated Bible now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford to the page in Deuteronomy 30:18 where it says, I've set before you, God is speaking through Moses, and I've set before you as a blessing and a curse and a blessing, death and life, therefore choose life. And I felt that, of course not to, it was famously, lustrous predecessor at Columbia University has always invoked, Sailor Barone said, Jewish history ought not to be lachrymose. But there are some moments actually where I do feel tears are massively appropriate. In fact, almost it would be inhuman not to shed them, not necessarily physically, and I actually had trouble occasionally on camera with that. But I do think if you flip, I'm trying to explain again to the non-Jewish audience that actually being prepared for the worst is not the same thing as assuming the worst. I mean, we are suitcase-ready religion, but actually one thing that it does is make for an extraordinary grip on the vitality life and a kind of abundant appetite for it. And that just the example I just mentioned, this Bible was written in 1476 in La Coruña in northwest Spain. So, shortly before, things had been bad for the Jews ever since 1391, but it was written not expecting to have to leave Spain and go to Portugal and go on all the kind of travels which eventually end up in Oxford at all. So that, you're absolutely right. I mean, I did really want to recover a sort of innocence about all this in a way, and not make celebration and that kind of vitality really always sort of shadowed by desperate fatalism. I mean, Jews are, we're all to some extent, as much as we are Jews, pessimists about things, but we're not fatalists, I think, really. And, you think about, I don't know, things that happen really in terrible circumstances in Theresienstadt, in Terezin, and even in Auschwitz and horrible places where still the instinct really to hang on to things that are something more than simply the absolute grim necessities of survival are profoundly moving. I mean, I was in the book, not in the program again. I was talking, somebody again, a young historian in the Warsaw Ghetto who is determined, who knows that they won't survive, and indeed he doesn't. He is part of the uprising in April 1943, but he really wants the day-to-day records of the ghetto, the apartment blocks, which are recorded in committee minutes, actually. He wants those to survive, and he buries, with his friend Israel Lichtenstein, a group of students, he hides them in milk churns so that it will be recovered after the war. And miraculously, there is one man called Hirschwasser who survives from this group only by jumping off the train on the way to Treblinka. And there's a wonderful book about this called Who Will Write Our History? And Emanuel Ringelblum's the leader of this name. But what he wants to do is exactly show that the day-to-day attempt to try and actually have some sort of life, have schools, have singing lessons for the children, have stories told by the old even when they're very sick to the next generation. He really wants to show how a fight to keep life going happened even as the most horrifying privation closed in was what the record even of the ghetto was. That's something that I found profoundly moving, really.
I guess picking up on this notion of...
Otherwise, I'll just add to that, otherwise Jews will just always be treated, in the non-Jewish world, we're treated as victims or bullies, or sometimes conspirators. And I hate that. And actually, for us really to accept that we're simply the stuff of endlessly repeated tragedy is to hand a victory to the anti-Semites in a way, I think.
Although I think it does beg a question, which is, if there's a story about ourselves that we want to correct, that it's told by others, what is the story about ourselves that we tell each other that can sustain us? Because, very much at the heart of your book is this notion of this kind of Jewish meta-narrative that has been sustaining in the absence of a territory, in the absence of a shared language, in the absence of all of these other kinds of similarities that other cultural groups or ethnicities have had. The film begins by, this is a Jew, this is a Jew, this is a Jew, and what do they have in common? You say all the things they don't, and then you say basically what unites them is this cycle of Jewish suffering, resilience.
No, I don't say that. I said it's a story.
A story.
Well, I do say suffering and resilience. No, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
I do, but I balance out.
Oh, no, and endurance and creativity.
Yeah.
So, but it's the cycle. I mean, that I think is the story. It's not simply the story of creativity, it's the cycle of, let's say, persecution followed by liberation, followed by persecution, followed by liberation, or suffering followed by creativity. The cyclicality of the wheel of sort of Jewish history. And, there's an old saying, once upon a time there was a man whose life was so good there's no story to tell about it. And the question is, what becomes the sustaining Jewish narrative if we were to one day achieve the kind of happy and boring life that is without cycles that I believe all of us would want for our children?
Yeah, that is, I don't have a good answer for that, actually, save to say that I think, and I've just said in the answer to your last question, that some of this sort of sense of intensity about sampling, drinking deep from life, comes about because of a sense of insecurity. That's true, but a very, very large part of, we're sitting here where we are, of American Jewish history actually has been not entirely about being terrified that,
But some would say, hence, the assimilation of American Jews.
But American Jewish life has not been exactly bereft of creativity.
No, but it might be bereft of ritualistic Judaism.
When were you last in, do you really think it is? No, I think actually American Jewish life, Judaic life, is flourishing in all its many manifestations, wouldn't you say? I mean, ultra-Orthodox, but in many other places as well. It's never been so, I would say, not never been so, but the kind of, it was America which produced many different ways of being part of Jewish observance. The Reform movement starts here, conservative movement starts here, the kind of, the repertoire of possibility of being braced into many, many kinds of Jewish observance seems to be extraordinarily rich in circumstances which were not necessarily under the hammer of persecution. So I suppose actually, you're right about, you're right to characterize it that way, but and certainly the issue, in one respect, there's an awful cyclical repetition, I think, and that's, Ari Shavit writes about it wonderfully in My Promised Land, but it is the kind of Masada Syndrome which happens. And as you know, we actually know that the leader of the Jews trapped in a citadel in York in 1190 invokes Masada in order to persuade, his own people that they should do the same and commit suicide. Some do, some don't. It's invoked again in the martyr. It's the Kiddush Hashem syndrome, invoked in the martyr narratives during the awful events of the First Crusade. So there is a very particular story of mass self-destruction, but on the other hand, the other story, the Jew's life story, which I tell in the book, is this wonderful moment where the young Maimonides is aware of a responsum given by a rabbi to a community in extreme distress. I think it was in Yemen, before the Messianic movement in Yemen. It's not the famous letter to Yemen, it's another moment which predates it. And the rabbi giving the response to him has said, when asked whether or not it was all right to convert under circumstances of coercion, and the rabbi said, absolutely not, the thing to do is die. And Maimonides is angry and horrified by this, actually, and has an entirely different view. So, and that, of course, is the case at other moments in Jewish history as well. What I've tried to do is really give a sense not just of hanging on, really, between the inevitable moments of the hammer blows of catastrophe, but the other norm, of which Maimonides is a phenomenal incarnation, is the sense in which your inheritance is to be the custodian of certain ethical principles and norms in an otherwise barbaric life. And I mean, very moving, I do talk about this in the first program and a lot in the book, is the relatively, well, the middle age, I was going to say old, but the middle age Josephus in Rome. And Josephus, who comes from, one half of the family Hasmoneans, the other half high priests, turns his coat to the Romans, is adopted by Vespasian, and so on. So it's very kind of morally complicated, to be generous about it. Then goes and lives in the emperor's apartments in Rome and witnesses the triumph by which the vessels of the temple are carried through the streets. And then and expects to be part of the Roman world and finds it's not entirely detached from a sense of disdain in the host society. But he then really, what he does in a book called Contra Appion, which is less read, is to want to disabuse the Romans of the grotesque prejudices and stereotypes they have. And then he embarks on a very moving account of what the Torah is and says, we have become the teachers of men in the greatest number of things. And he wants to represent Jewish life, actually, the positive aspects of Jewish life, as a kind of bundle of social decencies that are actually encoded by which Jews live. And they're the social decencies which don't correspond to a definition of a community made through power and force and land and territory. And that I certainly wanted, at a rather exalted level, to give that sense of what Jews stand for in those worlds. And then there is just the business of getting on with life. I wanted to write a book which was full of moments of Jews getting on with their lives, really, which often are missing from the great meta-narrative, I think.
You just spoke about Jews as being custodians of a certain system of ethics.
Yeah.
And obviously, your book is a story of stories that are passed down.
Right.
So you said in an interview that you had been hesitant to approach this subject for various reasons earlier in your life. One of the reasons that you gave, which you said just in passing, but I found really quite touching, was that you said you had too many aunts and uncles. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about what you meant.
I knew, I wrote a Jewish history book called Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel, which is sort of deservedly forgotten in a way, but I was happy to have written it. Aunts and uncles didn't speak to me because they thought it was partly an opening up of the notion that the Yishuv was completely self-sustaining. It needed both French Rothschild money and needed Arab labor. These are now almost kind of commonplaces. But there was a lot of sense that actually among my immediate family that I'd written this book to upset them, basically. Actually, that was the whole point of it. And wow, had I succeeded, actually. And they would all gather in a Seder somewhere else, really, and that I caused grief. And I suppose, I thought, it's probably not irrelevant that both my parents were no more when I started. Would I actually have started? I probably would with my parents alive, but there certainly is the sense that I wanted to be absolutely free in this project, really. In the first project also, there were all sorts of people I was not free of. It was a project delivered to me, an extraordinary archive, by Victor Rothschild, one of the most brilliant and dangerous people I've ever met. And he was always at me to really complete it before I was quite ready to finish it. And there was one moment, I'll show you this, where I walk into his house in Cambridge, and he offers me the sumptuous glass of Rothschild claret and smokes Abdallah cigarettes at me, and then the charm disappears, and the terrorizing patriarch appears, and he slams his hand on the table and says, "Do you know what the motto of our family is, Simon?" I still can't remember it. And he says, "Service," and by God we get it, actually. I suppose I didn't want to be, there was a sense of needing to be free of obligation. Really free of obligation from delivering yet another standard metaphor of sainted rabbis and martyrs, actually. I think that is the case.
We exchanged a lot of jokes backstage, but in a way, the ultimate Jewish joke is somehow inside of what you were just saying. The sort of irrepressible will to tell a story, to tell a full and expressive and authentic story that reveres those that came before, that those that came before would hate to read. I think there are a lot of middle-aged Jewish people with novels in drawers that they are waiting for a list of 5 people to die before they can publish. This is my last question, and then we're going to go to the questions from the audience.
We have a clip at the end.
And a clip,
well,
that's
we have
right.
a little clip,
right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, in the beginning, you spoke a bit about how the project might change others, and I wanted to know how it changed you.
Well, there are intellectual things really about methodology, which isn't the right answer, but they counted. For example, I at one point when I thought, well, things we've been talking about, words and stories, and this is really the rope of endurance, and so I thought, well, this makes very good radio. Not television. And actually, I still think there are all sorts of things I couldn't do in television that would make good radio. But I thought, so actually, as the project went on, I became more and more convinced, possibly convincing myself, that Jewish art is not an oxymoron, and that the world of images, you'll see this in the second program and very much in the book, is incredibly, it actually has a formative role for long periods in the life of Judaism. And this naturally made me think about the relationship of images. The second commandment for the first half millennium of the life of synagogues after the destruction of the temple was interpreted overwhelmingly as a prohibition on sculpture for obvious reasons to do with idolatry, not on images, not on painting or mosaics, even of the human form. So they're abundantly all over the synagogues of late antiquity and the early medieval period, and that made me think altogether in a longer way about the relationship of word and image, and words which are images, painting in the text of the Bibles and so on. But that, as I say, is more kind of arid. The sense, I think the way it changed me was rather in the spirit of that opening of the whole series. This is a Jew, this is a Jew, and what you see are every conceivable complexion and color and sense of where the Jews have come from, which is a big part of Jewish life in New York. And I suppose I feel the expansiveness of Jewish life. That's to say, the many, many places Jewish life has planted itself in and opened itself rather than closed itself. The Torah is, of course, there is a kind of, there was an absolutely indispensable core. But I began to think of Jewish life as an extraordinary kind of congregation of mutually interrupting voices. I've said a lot that Jews communicate by agreed mutual interruptions, of which we've been a demonstration. And that this is the case, my friend Leon Wieseltier, in a point when we're looking at a page of the Talmud, says, well, there's 11th century Tunisia, there's 13th century France, and all of these different pieces of texts and commentaries and meta-commentaries that you see on a page of the Talmud are in some sense talking and almost sometimes sort of shouting over each other. And I think sort of the glory of that, I felt very strongly that Judaism is actually, it's not a thing of iron, despite the halachic moments in the Talmud, as you know, are much less than the enormously, wonderfully, for me, digressive aspects of Agadah. And this extraordinary, humane, constantly self-expanding nature of what we are and where we're from is a kind of great and abundant glory. But it is also the case that actually Jews from one corner of the world to the other, from sort of Brazil to Cochin in India, to Baghdad, to Bamberg, really, will, any of them can find each other in each other's synagogues on Kol Nidre, and there'll be that extraordinary moment very early on in most services, close to the beginning of Kol Nidre, when it said, "All Israel stands before you." So I suppose at the end, I felt myself to be a kind of ventriloquist for this enormous congregation, not of all Israel, but of this immense host of different voices somehow united by this common memory. I don't know if that's... I think all history is a kind of ventriloquism. You are actually standing there and letting the voices of the dead and your ancestors and your extended ancestors and, reaching out to the whole of your particular kind of historical community. You're trying to give them voice, and you have to make choices. To some of them you say, Shah, and in that way that people say in shul, in synagogue, and some of them you want to amplify, really. I guess, also, Jonathan, you know how it is. I mean, the words of a non-Jew, Samuel Beckett, fail better, really, did occur to me, and still do, often during this particular enterprise.
Well, you spoke about how the sort of Jewish model of discourse is argument or speaking over one another, but so I assume you have been surprised by the absolute consensus of critical praise. I mean, it's impossible to imagine something about Jewish people that any two Jewish people would agree on.
Right.
But I have been looking in preparation for this.
You haven't looked hard enough. There are people there. But they are a minority, the critics. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Well, I think it's not an accident or coincidence. It speaks to the success of that act of ventriloquism that you were speaking about. And it was thrilling to read, and it also made me quite proud, personally.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So why don't we watch...
Do you want to watch this one?
Yeah.
Shall I say a very quick word about it? Believe it or not, for two wordy people, Jonathan and myself, and because of the obsession with text and so on, there was one moment when I wanted words to stop completely. And in fact, the second volume is called When Words Fail. And we wanted to... the series does not it doesn't circumnavigate the Holocaust, but I didn't really want to make a whole film about the Holocaust. There are so many great films of that. So we actually decided to shoot in Israel on Holocaust Day, partly because a lot of you will know, Yom HaShoah in Israel, everything stops. It stops everywhere, but literally stops. So if you're driving a car, you don't park, you just stop. And there's always somebody Israeli driving, being what it is, as you know, slams it, even though sirens are going. So I decided it might be an idea to give cameras to students in Israeli film schools in Haifa and Beersheba and Tel Aviv, and for them to go. What I wanted was a little sequence done in real time with no commentary and no music, and to go to many different kinds of places in Israel, to an old age home and a hospital and a factory and an army barracks, and just say film a minute before, 2 or 3 minutes afterwards, and film those 2 minutes. And then we edit it together, and I do say 3 words or so towards the end. But this was a moment, really, when memory does not need speech at all. This is the opening of the last program, so we'll end with that, and then questions.
Okay, so these are now questions from not only around the audience, but around the country. And the first is a question from New Orleans. Simon, if time travel was possible, which period in Jewish history would you most like to visit and why?
Oh, wow. Actually, that is something I've changed my mind about, really. There are so many moments, actually, where I was, had not registered the power of, and one is where Jewish show business is born. Where do we think it is, everybody? Not here. Mantua, in the middle of the 16th century. And in Mantua, there is a moment, sort of in the first half of the 16th century, before the Counter-Reformation closes in extremely cruelly, when the Catholic Church and popes and cardinals are incredibly interested in Kabbalah. Pope Clement VII, in particular, has a Hebrew teacher who he lodges in his Vatican apartments. The great Cardinal Egidio in Viterbo does the same. And there's a slightly more, for conversionary purposes, to be sure, but there is a kind of genuine rehumanization outside Spain and Portugal of this happening. And things start to get wonderfully curious. The first time that we know of when non-Jews go into the ghetto in Venice to see Purimspiel is 1531. The same time, some of the court cultures start to hire Jewish entertainers for their weddings already. The first double act are called Solly and Jacob, and they appear in Mantua.
I think they were at my wedding.
We don't know the jokes. They were at your wedding too. Were they expensive and were they any good?
Not very.
I bet they were. So there's an extraordinary figure in Mantua called Leone di Sommi, and who writes the first Hebrew comedy, the text of which has survived. All of Leone Sommi's plays were found in manuscript form at the end of the 19th century, a fantastic period of discovery of all sorts of manuscripts that are lost. There's a so-called Comedy of the Betrothed, which is, quite funny. But he's also performing and writing all kinds of plays for the townspeople of Mantua, and never on Shabbat or Chagim or festivals. And he's so good that they don't try and order him. He has what starts as an amateur Purimspiel troupe, and then becomes a kind of professional company. And he's also the person who has to argue as a kind of lawyer if there are cases, if the guild won't allow Jewish fabric makers to do something. He argues that in front of the local magistrates. Sommi writes a most wonderful book called the Quattro Dialoghi, boringly, the 4 dialogues, which is the first manual of stagecraft. It goes through all the business, should we try and correspond to the way the Greeks may have had their theatre, or should we do? And he's not interested in Greek stylization, he's interested in a natural way of speaking. There is a great, almost certainly Jewish actress in Rome called Fiammetta Romana, who is an actress, by the way. Men don't always play women parts. But it's an extraordinary book because it's about makeup and lighting and body language. And I try, this is in volume 2, everybody, to encourage you to buy that one as well when it comes out. I try and give a sense, because we have so much abundant information about Sommi's own theatre, including designs for stage sets, of what it was like to be part. And I think that is a homage to my old dad, Arthur, who wanted to be a thespian really badly. And I think one of the few mean Shamas, my grandfather, I didn't know, said, if you join a theatre, don't bother coming home. My father, capitulated. He became a great amateur theatrical producer of everything from Shakespeare to kind of vaudeville. And he had lots of actor friends who used to come around. But he really kind of made me, this will shock you to hear, Jonathan, an early talker. I mean, we had these little 11-year-olds. I used to do these debates as an 11-year-old, and should Britain abandon its independent deterrent? And my dad used to stand in the back and go something which I fear I may have to put on my tombstone if I want an epitaph. He'd say, "Louder, Simon, louder," and incredibly loud, the first time, so this theatre thing, I think, is the answer to New Orleans. The first time he took me to Shakespeare, I was 10 years old. I saw Richard Burton as Henry V. But the condition was that I learnt the speech of the king before Harfleur. And I stood on my mother's, sitting room chair with her broom doing it, Once more to the breach, dear friends, once more. We'll fill the walls up with our English dead in peace. You know how it goes. So I would love to have been in Mantua in its golden moment of the birth of Jewish showbiz, because it included dancing and music. The first great dancing master was a man called Isacco Macerano, super Jewish. I mean, he was the dancing rabbi. Oh, yeah.
I know mine isn't. This is a question from Durham, North Carolina, but I flipped through these to sort of weed out any that wouldn't be appropriate, and half of them are some version of this question. I had
the most amazing phone call in radio show the other day, Diane Reams, and somebody phones up, and he clearly had not said this to the screener, whatever it was, and said, "Actually, Professor John, what I really want to ask you is actually, in all your research, could you tell whether Jesus was tall or short?" And I said, "He didn't take a selfie. What can I tell you? We'll never know."
I sort of wish this were that question, but instead, it's anti-Semitism is growing again in Europe. Does the history of the Jews suggest it will always be with us?
Oh, well, I mean, it is. I don't think it's growing. Well, it is. It is a problem in Hungary. It's certainly a problem in France. The horrible Dieudonné. Do you know what I really resent about Dieudonné? He calls that jester the cannelle. Mm-hmm. I like to cook cannelle. Anyone else like? I can't do it now. It's
that's your act of resistance now.
Yeah, it would be. It would be an act of resistance. That's true, actually. Recover the cannelle. The cannelle is basically haute cuisine's answer to gefilte fish. Come on, you must have caught. It's a dumpling, preferably of pike. We do pike and carp. Anybody? I have a cookery column, or have one actually. And if you come and see me, buy a book, and I'll give you the secret recipe for the kosher cannelle of resistance. What was the question? Again, is it always going to be with us?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose the answer is, what would we do without it? We're trying to change stereotypes, so it's very hard to do. As Moshe and Jaime are going past a church one day, and there's a sign up says, "Converts needed, $50 bonus for signing," and Moshe said, "Oh, disgusting." And Jaime says, "Well, times are hard." And he says, "What are you saying, Shonda?" He said, "The Moranos were in and out. Well, how hard can it be?" And so Moshe says, "Well, this is disgusting, but maybe we could split it." And so off Jaime goes, and 20 minutes later he comes out. And Senator Moshe says, "So, how was it?" And Jaime said, And there's a big pause. And then Moshe says, "So, the $25. And Jaime says, "That's all you Jews think about. Money, money, money."
Do you know the joke, which is really too long to tell now, and it's your night, but about...
But you're going to.
No, I'm really
you
not.
You
no, I really shouldn't. I really shouldn't.
That means he's going to.
No, it really doesn't. It means...
Come on, Gracie.
No. It means I take pleasure in your asking me to tell it, and I'm not going to tell it. Right. But about the blood transfusions... Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll tell it to you later.
Good. So unfair to the audience. You say,
I'll write a book one day.
Come on.
No. I'll write a book one day, and you can interview me, and I will tell the joke.
Okay.
I wouldn't hold your breath, though. Can you make some predictions about Jewish history over the next 100 to 200 years?
No. Next.
Okay, this is anti-Semitism. Just sort of off the target.
Cooking? No.
As a historian, can you comment on the argument that the Jews are not a people?
Oh, yeah, Shlomo Sand's point of view. It's very hard to actually respond to that, much less sort of make a lengthy comment without relentless and, at this point, I think, non-thrilling argument about what constitutes people anyway. Jews pose the question about whether those definitions of an ethnicity, really. I mean, my feeling is that we are, even though, the famous DNA samples of, particularly of the Y male chromosome descending down through a Kohanim show an extraordinarily much greater degree of commonality than we would have thought without them, nonetheless, it's certainly true to say that we're very, in a strict sense, ethnically heterogeneous. And this is partly because, and this is something else I did really was, I had the view that we proselytize much more than we are accustomed to think. And wow, some of the best recent scholarship has shown this to be extraordinarily true. For example, there's a whole chapter called the Cohens of Arabia, which is about actually pre-Islamic Arabia, where there was a very substantial population of Arab Jews, of both people who were ethnically Arabian, Idumean, Itureans, long stock inside the Arabian Peninsula, but they were completely Orthodox Jews. The entire kingdom of Himyar, which is the most important state, roughly where Yemen is now, was a Jewish state until it was destroyed by an Ethiopian Christian army in 525 CE. So we have this, as you know, almost 250,000 Israelis now from South Asia or North Africa or tropical Africa. So, does that make us a people? Yes, it does, because a people are, again, as in the story, bonded together by a common tradition, a memory. That's what I think kind of makes a people, I would say. I mean, the one thing Shlomo Sand's book, he was concerned to say, well, since it's proselytized, and, who knows how many Ashkenazim may be descended from the Chazars or not, I think that's then there's no relationship to Israel, really, and we don't have any relationship truly to each other. That was preposterous. It was such a reductivist, utilitarian, argument, which totally overlooked what is at the core of what binds us together, quite apart from, the sacred books, beginning with the Torah, and that is the subject of my whole book. It is a reply to that view, that a people can't be, except in their own deluded imagination, united by a common memory. That's exactly what we are. See you at the Passover Seder next.
So these obviously aren't a representative sample of American Jewry, but all but one or two of them are really informed by concern.
How fat or thin was King David? Or?
No, by concern, by a kind of fear, one or another. And this
I would say, do we want to, without, I don't want to be facetiously churlish to these questions, about European anti-Semitism. So can I say a word about that, since it seems to be... it can be overdone in this country. I think particularly, there's a sense in which, thank God, we're in America. I mean, absolutely. But because, it's Weimar, not 38, but, excuse me, not 33, but Weimar 1929 or something really ugly is round the corner, and yet another horrible harvest of extermination is going to happen. I don't really buy that. I think actually historians anyway think calamities come in their own particular ways, doesn't necessarily make them less calamitous. But what I would say is it's true, this is a commonplace now, but it's certainly, you couldn't possibly deny this, that anti-Zionist polemics have leaked over into pure anti-Semitism. That's to say, part of what the Israelis are said to be, a part of the hostility to Israel, it scarcely does a hop, skip, and a jump before it's all to do with Jews controlling the media, the banks, the ancient international conspiracy theories. And that I say is becoming more hideously respectable. Not just it's actually not a working class thing in Britain. It's a curious mix of the right, who've always been anti-Zionist as kind of romantic Arabists, with the chattering classes of the left, who now think all Jews pretend to be victims but are actually bullies. And there is this hideous who actually don't forgive us for being victims enough all the time. And that is toxic, and that is getting worse. And that was another reason to try and change the subject, to sort of say, this is our history, and try this and see what you think when you've finished it. May have no effect.
Maybe we can end on a sort of forward-looking, not optimistic, but forward-looking note. I've had a sort of a long-going argument with an Israeli friend of mine about where Jewish history is being created now. And my attitude, which I'm not even sure I agree with, is that...
You don't agree with your own attitude?
I almost never
That
do.
is incredibly Jewish.
But it is that...
Can I agree with your attitude even if you don't? You know,
only because we're not related. Is that, you know, the American Jews are creating the Jewish identity mostly through Jewish culture, and that the ways that we are perceived by others and by ourselves are the creations of American Jews. And he says, you've got to be kidding me. You know, do you think that anybody's going to remember Woody Allen or Philip Roth or Jerry Seinfeld 100, much less 500, much less 1,000 years from now? Everything that's important that's happening in Jewry is happening in Israel. And it's the epic of Israel, the story of Israel. So clearly there's not one or another, but there are ways of thinking about what is important that's happening now when we pull back the lens. You know, some would say it's the Lubavitcher movement. Some would say it is anti-Semitism. There are a lot of ways of thinking about it, and I'm curious if you have had this mental exercise. You know, if I had been creating this project, or 100 years from now, if a future historian, what would they see as the most important developments of this moment?
Well, I actually don't think it's geography specific, as a matter of fact. I mean, I know it's going to be very hard to kind of uproot that particular argument you're having with your Israeli friend, but really, it's a very old argument, goodness, but it's an argument about whether or not Judaism is constituted from an intense inward, endlessly self-replenishing look at itself from its own core sources and its own core identity, and endlessly strengthening, you know, from essentially a dialogue spoken inside itself. That's really strikes me as the kind of the Haredi project in a way. And then there is the other kind of sense of actually the nourishment of Jewish identity, which is the opposite, which is not assimilationist. There is this horrible word which is used in academia, and forgive me if there are any professors of acculturation out there. It's a particularly unlovely word, but it's not the same thing as assimilation. There's, whether you go back to medieval Hebrew poetry, which invents a new kind of Hebrew by looking at what Arabic poetry is doing and then giving it a very distinctly different Hebrew Jewish sort of tone and music, or whether you look at wonderful Jewish illuminated manuscripts, not just Haggadot, but Bibles and Sidurim and Machzorim at the end of the Middle Ages, which again used some kind of Christian formulae, but completely made it over with a gorgeous, radiant, extraordinary kind of Jewish iconography. That's a different. So the argument is whether or not Judaism is replenished, really, by a kind of an engagement with the non-Jewish world, or whether an engagement with the non-Jewish world is ultimately entropic, whether it's something which is destined as an act of self-destruction. And that seems to me going on both in, hey, you know, is Frank here tonight? That's going on within the New Republic right now, actually. But it goes on in the diaspora, and it goes on in Israel, actually. And it's actually the same kind of argument will eventually start to be very important, I'm convinced, in the Muslim world too, and is sort of beginning. So it is an argument about the relationship between an eclectic understanding of tradition and, as I say, a sort of inwardly self-reinforcing one. I don't know, that's a sort of, but I don't think there is a kind of a specific geography of rejuvenation. And, you know, it must be a truism, mustn't it, that you know, that these two sides, whether it's Israel and the Galut and the diaspora, are destined, if not doomed, always to be mutually interrupting each other and have an argument. You know, it's like Mr. Cohen rescued from the desert island. This has got to be the last word. And the captain says, I'm so happy we could do this for you, Mr. Cohen, but why did you build 2 synagogues? And he said, one I go to, the other one I wouldn't be seen dead in.
I think your answer gets at the difference between Abba Eben's heritage, which everybody has been comparing your project to, which is very much based in Jews as in their relationship to land,
Yes.
and yours, which is very much based in the relationship between Jews and ideas.
Yeah, that I think is a fair summary of the difference. Yeah.
Okay, we're very much out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John.